Shabbat Shalom. I know you won't believe this, but this discussion this morning is backed by popular demand, which is, how do you have a conversation in your family about your end-of-life wishes? And I don't think this is just a conversation for people who are old-ish, because the truth is none of us knows the hour of our death. It's an important thing to think about. So here's the plan. I'll start us off by reading an excerpt from Sheryl Sandberg's Facebook page. Sheryl Sandberg is the COO of Facebook, and her husband died tragically in May. He slipped off of a treadmill and sustained a head injury. And what's interesting about her Facebook page post is she wrote it on Shloshim, at the end of 30 days of mourning, which traditionally is the end of your official mourning period for a spouse. And the reason I'd like to look at this source is it may touch on why it is so difficult to have this conversation and the grief that we fear contemplating when we open up a conversation about the end of life. So I'll read the excerpt. We'll talk about some of the fears we might have around having the conversation, and also why it can be important to have the conversation. And I'll close with offering you some Jewish resources on what does the Jewish law or tradition say about end-of-life issues, how to let go and when to let go. Here is what Sheryl Sandberg writes. Today is the end of Shloshim for my beloved husband, the first 30 days. Judaism calls for a period of intense mourning known as Shiva that lasts 7 days after a loved one is buried. After Shiva, most normal activities can be resumed, but it is the end of Shloshim that marks the completion of religious mourning for a spouse. A childhood friend of mine, who is now a rabbi, recently told me that the most powerful one-line prayer he has ever read is, "Let me not die while I am still alive." I would have never understood that prayer before losing Dave. Now I do. I think when tragedy occurs, it presents a choice. You can give in to the void, the emptiness that fills your heart, your lungs, constricts your ability to think or even breathe, or you can try to find meaning. These past 30 days, I've spent many of my moments lost in that void, and I know that many future moments will be consumed by the vast emptiness as well. But when I can, I want to choose life and meaning. I have lived 30 years in these 30 days. I am 30 years sadder. I feel like I am 30 years wiser. I've gained a more profound understanding of what it means to be a mother. I have learned that I never really knew what to say to others in need. I think I got this all wrong before. I tried to assure people that it would be okay, thinking that hope was the most comforting thing I could offer. But a friend of mine with late-stage cancer told me that the worst thing people could say to him was, "It's gonna be okay." That voice in his head would scream, "How do you know it's gonna be okay? Do you not understand that I might die?" I learned this past month what he was trying to teach me. Real empathy is sometimes not insisting that it will be okay, but acknowledging that it is not. I've learned some practical stuff that matters. Although we now know that Dave died immediately, I didn't know that it was in the ambulance, and that trip to the hospital was unbearably slow, and I still hate every car that did not move to the side. I've learned how ephemeral everything can feel, and maybe everything is. That whatever rug you are standing on can be pulled right out from under you with absolutely no warning. I've learned to ask for help, and I've learned how much help I need. Until now, I've been the older sister, the COO, the doer and the planner. I did not plan this, and when it happened, I was not capable of doing much of anything. Those closest to me took over. They planned, they arranged. They told me where to sit and reminded me to eat. They're still doing so much to support me and my children. I've learned that resilience can be learned. Perseverance. This does not have to affect every area of my life, but it's the ability to compartmentalize and stay healthy. At At the same time, there are moments when I can't let people in. I went to portfolio night at school where kids show their parents around the classroom to look at their work hung on the walls. So many of the parents, all of whom had been so kind, tried to make eye contact or say something that they thought would be comforting. I looked down the entire time so no one could catch my eye for fear of breaking down, and I hope they understood. I've learned gratitude, real gratitude, for things I took for granted before, like life. As heartbroken as I am, I look at my children each day and rejoice they are alive. I'm truly grateful to the many who have offered their sympathy. A colleague told me that his wife, whom I'd never met, decided to show her support by going back to school to get her degree, something she'd been putting off for years. When the circumstances allow, I believe as much as ever in leaning in. And so many men, from those I know well to those I will likely never know, are honoring Dave's life by spending more time with their families. I can't even express the gratitude I feel to my family and friends who've done so much for me and reassured me that they will continue to be there. I was talking to one of these friends about a father-child activity that Dave is not here to do. We came up with a plan to fill in for Dave, but I cried to him, "I want Dave. I want option A." He put his arms around me and said, "Option A is not available, so let's just kick the expletive out of option B." Dave, to honor your memory and raise your children as they deserve to be raised, I promise to do all I can. And even though Shloshim has ended, I will mourn for option A. I will always mourn for option A. As Bono sang, there is no end to grief, and there is no end to love. I love you, Dave. So having read those very honest words that she posted so publicly, why might it be that it's so difficult to have a conversation about the end of someone's life and what kind of medical procedures and funeral arrangements they would like? Yes, we don't want to acknowledge their absence. We don't want to contemplate a world in which they don't exist. It might make us think about our own frailty, our own mortality, and that's not a good thing. That's for old people, that's not for me. Right? If we make arrangements, if we talk about death, we might have perhaps irrational fear that it will speed up death, that it will make the death come sooner.
It's almost like saying, if you make such and such plans, everything's going to be okay. If we do this, we do this, make this plan, you know, why do that such and such way, everything's going to be okay. It won't.
So we like to be able to plan, and we like to say it's going to be okay.
What's implying that we have a solution here that's going to make this?
That by talking about it and being prepared for it, maybe it doesn't really make it better. You're implying that you can handle this.
There's a fear that you'll change your mind about what you want and not get a chance to talk about it.
Oh, right. What if you change your mind about what you want at the end of life and you're not able or can't talk about it then?
Married to someone a long time, there's an assumption that you know them well enough that you know what they want. So by talking about it, you're admitting you might not know them as well as you think you do.
So there's an assumption that if you've been married a long time or been the child of someone for a long time, you should know them well enough to know what they want. And perhaps one of the fears of having this conversation is discovering that you're surprised by what they want, that you didn't know.
Talking to our children, even in proximity of this conversation, they say, no, Mom and Dad, you're going to be here for the next 50 years. And so that sort of makes us not want to, at that point, get into the conversation.
So when Herb tries to bring the conversation up with his children, they say, "Nah, you're going to live 1,000 more years, and okay, we're having a nice family time together. I don't want to push this conversation. Let's change the topic a little bit. Why might the conversation about what sort of medical procedures you do or don't want at the end of your life, and what sort of funeral arrangements you might want, why should we have that conversation? What's positive about it? Nat?
Well, as a matter of fact, Esther and I had this conversation with our kids about 6 months ago. And we knew what we wanted for end of life, for funeral. We have made all those arrangements. The kids were very, very nervous. Go ahead.
Okay. So you've had that conversation, and it sounds like it was an emotional one to have.
Our kids were very appreciative that we had done this ourselves and lifted that burden off them.
So it's a gift you can give your children for after you're gone. You've lifted off the burden. You're in the ICU, you can't answer questions about what you want, but you have an advance directive, right? Or you've made this is where I want you to send my body, it's paid for, it's done. You don't have to worry about that. You just can experience your grief and be a family. You can have confidence in the last impression you're going to leave with people, right? You know that it happened, that you did it your way, right? That it's an expression of who you are.
I've seen it too often where parents don't discuss and then the kids argue among themselves.
Right, if we don't know, sometimes siblings fight about what to do next. Because they don't know and they disagree about it.
When it happens, it's there's so much going on, and no matter how prepared you are, you're not going to be fully prepared. So, like the ones left behind, so having those plans made ahead of time at least takes a certain level of burden and planning off of those left behind.
Right, we're clearly never ready for the people we love to die, even if they're 106 and lived a good life. But at least having those plans helps us be a little more prepared.
I think it also gives some peace to those who are passing, because they've left things in order. They haven't left things for their kids to argue about and figure out.
It can give the person who's passing peace of mind. They know I did everything I could to make this smooth for people. I've left things in order.
I think one of the things is that it also helps balance the conversation with the family, because Karen lost her brother very young. And one of the conversations is not only planning for your parent or your grandparent, but the conversation also can turn around at what would that child want, or that young adult want, because unfortunately that sometimes also.
Well, as a critical care physician, but also as a hospice and palliative care physician, I think it goes one step further. It also helps the people that take care of you. I deal with these situations really on a daily basis, and I think it's important for your doctors to know what do you want, what you don't want. And when I sit down with families, it's a lot easier when I walk in a room and have a conversation where I know what the patient wants. And I can say to a family member, this is really, really what this patient wants. It's really not a decision, but you're being a messenger to what your mom or dad or your brother or sister really wants.
So your physician is sure what you wanted, and that can be really helpful, because sometimes if you complete one medical procedure, it can lead to a line of others. I wanted to let you know there are a couple of very helpful resources out there. So the conservative movement has 2 advanced directives online. One is more traditional, and one is more liberal. And it will walk you through a series of questions about medical procedures, such as feeding tubes, ventilators, pain medication, hydration, things that you need to figure out at the end of life. And it can give you some idea of the things you should be considering. The other source that's really helpful is the Conversation Project. It's a nonprofit, and their goal is to have as many people have conversations about end of life before they're actually at the end of life. And that one, it has more of your philosophy to think through. For example, do I prefer to do whatever the doctor thinks is best, or do I prefer to have every little detail explained to me, right? Which is your medical treatment philosophy? So there are two different resources that I think serve two different purposes in helping us think through the end of life. I wanted to share with you some Jewish sources about how and when do we end life, because sometimes it's not so obvious, right? How dead is dead. So, when Rebbe became deathly ill, Rebbe is the man who edited the entire Mishnah, so he was a very great sage. When Rebbe became deathly ill, the scholars declared a public fast. His students and colleagues prayed for his recovery. Rebbe's maidservant went up to the roof and pleaded, "On high, the angels want Rebbe to join them, and down below, they want Rebbe to stay. May it be your will that those down below should prevail with their prayers." So at first, she wanted Rebbe to live. But when she saw that Rebbe was suffering, she changed her prayer. "May it be your will that the angels above prevail." She said, maybe it's his time now. The scholars, however, continued their constant prayers for Rebbe's recovery, and in doing so, kept his soul anchored in this world. The maidservant grabbed a jar and hurled it from the roof. The sudden crash startled the scholars and momentarily disrupted their prayers. Rebbe's soul promptly departed. The sages asked his student Bar Kapra to investigate, so he went and found that Rebbe had passed away. He tore his garment, and he reported back, "The angels and the mortals struggled over the holy ark," right? Rebbe is such a scholar that he's like the ark. He contains Torah. "The mortals and angels have struggled over the holy ark, but the angels vanquished the mortals, and the holy ark has been captured." So I think what's contained in the metaphor of this story is knowing how and when to let go is not an easy choice. So here are some texts from the Halacha that might guide you. Sefer HaChasidim teaches, if a doctor says eating a certain food would kill a person, then even if they beg for it, we're forbidden to give that food. However, don't cry out when the soul of a person who is dying leaves and force it to return and suffer on earth longer. So perhaps a modern day equivalent would be morphine, right? You can't give someone so much morphine that you cause them to die, but neither should you say, well, we don't want you to get addicted to morphine, so we're not going to give you pain medication in the end. The Shulchan Aruch says, don't begin treating the person as a dead body, for example, tearing your clothes or giving a eulogy, before the person dies, even if death is imminent. So I see in that teaching, we should value life, even if it's, the very end and a very fragile life. The Mapah says, we can't accelerate death, but we can remove obstacles that prevent death. So you can't do outright euthanasia, but if someone doesn't want to be on a feeding tube, then halakhically they don't need to be on a feeding tube. These sources provide guidelines, but it's really in those advanced directives that you'll get the details of how these ancient sources translate into modern Jewish practice. And so I'll conclude by saying my prayer for us all is that we find the courage to have these conversations with the people we love the most, and to find a comfort and an intimacy in discussing an important topic together. Shabbat Shalom.